The vibration of Anna's phone cut through the stillness of the kitchen, an unexpected disruption that sent my heart into an uneasy rhythm. I was standing at the counter, pouring wine into the glasses I'd just set out, the candlelight casting a soft glow across the table. It was meant to be a quiet evening, just the two of us. She had insisted it was long overdue, a moment to reconnect. And yet, here I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on the glowing screen of her phone as it buzzed insistently against the granite countertop. The name on the screen wasn't familiar. A first name, innocuous on its own, but paired with the message preview that followed, it felt like a blade slicing through the calm I had tried so hard to cultivate. The words weren't overtly suspicious, just a short, casual sentence. But there was an undertone that made the air around me feel heavier, almost suffocating. My chest tightened as the possibilities churned in my mind, each one more damning than the last. I hadn't meant to look. I'd reached for my glass, intending to sit and wait for her to come downstairs. But the buzzing had drawn my attention, and now I couldn't look away. The sound of her footsteps descending the stairs snapped me out of my trance, and I hurriedly placed the glass down, as if trying to erase the seconds I had spent staring at her phone. When she entered the room, she was radiant, her hair falling in waves over her shoulders, her dress fitting her in a way that once made me proud. Tonight, though, it filled me with unease. She smiled as she approached, but I couldn't help noticing the way her gaze flicked briefly toward the phone on the counter before she looked at me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a momentary spark of awareness, maybe even tension. As we sat down to eat, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her laughter seemed forced, her answers to my questions too rehearsed. She reached for her glass often, sipping in a way that suggested she needed the wine more than she wanted it. I tried to focus on the meal, on the small talk, but my mind kept drifting back to that message, to the way her demeanor seemed to shift whenever her phone buzzed. Later that evening, when she excused herself to take a call upstairs, I couldn't resist any longer. I picked up her phone. The screen lit up instantly, revealing no passcode, no barrier to the truth I now sought. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her messages, my breath shallow and quick. What I found made my stomach drop. The texts weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. There were inside jokes, casual flirtations, and mentions of meetups that had no place in the life we had built together. Her words carried an intimacy that cut deeper than any confession could have. And then there were the photos, selfies of her smiling, laughing, wearing the same dress she had worn to our last anniversary dinner. But she hadn't sent those to me. I placed the phone back on the counter, my mind spinning. The room felt too bright, too warm, as though the walls were closing in. The faint sound of her voice floated down from upstairs, carefree and light, as though nothing in her world had changed. But mine had. In an instant, the foundation of everything I believed in had cracked, the life I thought we were building now littered with the debris of her lies. When she came back downstairs, her smile was as bright as ever, her voice filled with the same practiced warmth. She asked me if I had enjoyed dinner, if the wine was to my liking. I couldn't respond. My throat felt tight, my words lodged somewhere between disbelief and despair. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, the weight of what I had discovered pressing down on my chest. The rise and fall of her breath, once a comforting rhythm, now felt like a mockery of the trust one had placed in her. Every moment replayed in my mind. The messages, the photos, the casual way she had smiled at me over dinner, as though nothing was wrong. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, to shatter the facade she had so carefully constructed. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed to understand the full extent of what I was dealing with. I needed to know how deep the betrayal went. The next morning, as she left for work, I felt the weight of her kiss on my cheek. It lingered there, a cruel reminder of what I had believed to be real. As her car pulled out of the driveway, I found myself standing in the kitchen again, staring at the phone she had left behind on the counter. This time I didn't hesitate. I scrolled further back through her messages, piecing together the fragments of a life I hadn't known she was living. The words blurred together as I read. each one adding another layer to the growing chasm between us. The depth of her betrayal became clearer with every message, every photo, every casual exchange that revealed just how long this had been going on. By the time I put the phone down, my hands were shaking, my mind racing with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. The life we had built together, the love I had thought was unshakable, now felt like a cruel illusion. And as I stood there, staring at the remnants of her double life, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after my discovery, the house felt unnervingly quiet. I lingered in the kitchen longer than usual, my coffee growing cold as I stared at the spot where her phone had sat the night before. Every sip tasted bitter, my thoughts clouded with the weight of what I had uncovered. Her betrayal wasn't just a single act. It was a tapestry woven with lies, secrets, and stolen moments. The realization sat heavy in my chest. As the hours passed, I knew I couldn't stop with what I had found. I needed to understand the full picture. Was this a fleeting mistake, or was it something far deeper? The truth, painful as it was, seemed like the only way forward. That afternoon, when Anna left for her usual Saturday run, a routine she had always been diligent about, I made my move. Her laptop was sitting on the desk in the living room, the screen dark, but the power light glowing faintly. She had never been secretive about her devices before, a detail I now realized had lulled me into a false sense of trust. The laptop opened easily, no password blocking my path. My fingers hovered over the trackpad as I took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever I might find. Her email was the first place I looked. My pulse quickened as I typed his name into the search bar, the letters feeling heavy under my fingers. The results appeared instantly, a series of messages stretching back months. Some were brief and innocuous, meeting confirmations, shared jokes, but others made my stomach twist. They talked about dinners, weekends away, and moments that were unmistakably intimate. He called her beautiful, radiant, even irreplaceable, and she responded with words that cut through me like shards of glass. I couldn't believe how easily she had shared parts of herself with him that were supposed to belong only to us. I scrolled further, compelled by equal parts devastation and determination. One email in particular caught my eye, a confirmation for a hotel reservation. The dates matched a weekend she had claimed to be on a work retreat. I remembered that weekend vividly. I had stayed home, watching movies alone, content in the belief that she was furthering her career. Now I knew better. The next folder I opened was labeled photos, and I felt a fresh wave of nausea as the screen filled with images. Many were of us, vacations, family gatherings, snapshots of the life we had shared. But nestled among them were photos of him. Casual, candid shots of the two of them in places I didn't recognize. There was one of her, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years, standing beside him at what looked like a vineyard. Another of them laughing together at a small cafe, her hand resting lightly on his arm. I closed the folder abruptly, the weight of what I'd seen settling over me like a suffocating blanket. My hands shook as I stared at the screen, the evidence of her betrayal staring back at me in black and white. This wasn't just a moment of weakness or a passing mistake. This was deliberate. This was a choice, made over and over again, to deceive me. I opened her work calendar next, searching for more clues. There were recurring entries, meetings scheduled with no details, marked as private. The dates aligned perfectly with the messages and photos I'd found. I realized how meticulously she had planned everything, each step taken with the confidence that I would never question her. I copied everything, emails, photos, even the calendar entries, onto a USB drive. It felt cold and calculated, but I needed this. I needed to confront her with the full scope of what I had found, to lay it all out in the open and demand answers. As I finished, I heard the front door open, her footsteps light and carefree as she returned from a run. My heart raced as I quickly closed the laptop, the screen going dark just as she entered the room. She smiled at me, her face flushed and glowing from the exertion. It was the same smile I had fallen in love with, the same warmth that had once made me feel invincible. But now it felt like a mask, She asked how my day had been, her voice cheerful and easy. I mumbled a response, avoiding her gaze as I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. The weight of what I now knew hung between us, invisible but oppressive. That evening, I replayed the evidence in my mind as she sat beside me on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if nothing had changed. Every text, every photo, every lie was etched into my memory, a painful reminder of how deeply she had betrayed me. I wanted to confront her then and there, to throw the truth in her face and demand to know why. But I hesitated. I needed time to process, to plan, to figure out how to navigate the wreckage of what we had built. The confrontation would come. I knew it was inevitable. But not tonight. For now, I sat in silence, the USB drive burning a hole in my pocket, the weight of her lies pressing down on me like a storm cloud ready to burst. I knew that when the confrontation came, it would change everything. But in that moment, I wasn't sure if I was ready for what would come next. The night felt heavier than usual, the silence in the house thick with unspoken words. I had spent hours pacing the floor of my office, replaying every moment of discovery, every piece of evidence I had gathered. It was time. I couldn't live in the shadows of her lies anymore. The confrontation wasn't just inevitable. It was necessary. Anna was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over her legs, scrolling through her phone. The same device that had betrayed her secrets now rested casually in her hand, as if it didn't hold the power to shatter everything. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, the weight of what I was about to say pressing down on my chest. I walked into the room, my steps deliberate, and stood across from her. She glanced up, her expression shifting from casual warmth to cautious curiosity. I could tell she sensed something was off. I didn't sit. I didn't smile. I simply stood there, the USB drive clutched tightly in my hand. I told her we needed to talk, my voice steady but cold. She put her phone down, her posture stiffening as the blanket slipped from her lap. I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the way her hands fidgeted slightly as though trying to prepare for whatever was coming. I started with a simple statement. I know. The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Her face changed instantly, the color draining from her cheeks as her eyes widened. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence that followed was deafening. I laid it all out, the texts, the photos, the hotel reservation, the private meetings marked on her calendar. I described the messages in detail, reciting phrases that had been seared into my mind. Her name paired with his, their plans, their laughter, their intimacy. I watched as each word hit her like a blow, her shoulders sinking under the weight of her guilt. She tried to deny it at first, her voice shaky, her words stumbling over themselves. She claimed it wasn't what it looked like, that I was misinterpreting things, that I didn't have the full story. But the evidence was irrefutable. I showed her the photos, the messages, the damning timeline that matched perfectly with her so-called work commitments. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized there was no escape. She stopped denying and started apologizing, her words a flood of remorse and regret. She begged for understanding, for forgiveness, for another chance. She told me it was a mistake, that she hadn't meant for it to happen, that it didn't mean anything. I listened in silence, my jaw tight, my hands clenched at my sides. Her words felt hollow, her explanations meaningless against the backdrop of everything I had uncovered. She asked me to believe her, to trust that she still loved me, that we could fix this. I told her she had already broken my trust. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt with apologies and promises. It was a fragile thing, and she had shattered it with every lie, every secret, every moment she had chosen someone else over me. She tried to argue that it hadn't changed how she felt about me, that she had never stopped loving me. But love wasn't enough. Love didn't excuse betrayal. Love didn't erase the pain of being deceived, of being replaced, of being made to feel like I wasn't enough. Her tears flowed freely now, her voice cracking as she pleaded with me not to give up on us. She promised to end it, to cut him out of her life completely, to do whatever it took to make things right. But her words were like echoes in an empty room, reaching me too late to make a difference. I told her I needed time, that I couldn't make any decisions in the heat of the moment. I needed space to think, to process, to figure out what came next. She begged me not to leave, her voice rising with desperation, but I couldn't stay. Not tonight. I walked out of the living room, her sobs following me as I climbed the stairs to the guest bedroom. The door closed behind me with a hollow finality, the sound echoing in the quiet of the house. I leaned against the door, my head resting against the wood, my chest tight with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. The confrontation was over, but the aftermath loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. The love we had shared, the life we had built, was now fractured beyond recognition. And as I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the darkened room around me, I couldn't help but wonder if there was anything left to save. The morning after the confrontation was eerily quiet. I woke in the guest bedroom, the unfamiliar surroundings amplifying the ache in my chest. The sunlight streaming through the window felt harsh, intrusive, as though it had no place in the wreckage of what my life had become. I could hear Anna moving around downstairs, her footsteps hesitant and subdued, the usual rhythm of her morning routine now fractured by the weight of the night before. I stayed in the guest room for hours, unable to face her or the reality of our shattered marriage. My phone buzzed with texts from friends and family, invitations to weekend plans and casual check-ins that suddenly felt impossibly distant. I didn't respond. I couldn't bring myself to pretend everything was fine. By midday, I finally forced myself out of bed. When I entered the kitchen, Anna was sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes red-rimmed and glassy. I could see the hope in her expression, the tentative way she started to speak, as though trying to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. I said nothing. I made my coffee in silence, the sound of the spoon clinking against the cup louder than her trembling voice. She asked if we could talk, if we could try to work through this, but I shook my head. Not now. Not yet. The wound was too fresh, the betrayal too raw. She didn't press me further. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of anger, grief, and confusion. I went to work, threw myself into projects, and tried to drown out the noise in my head. But it didn't help. Every quiet moment was filled with images of her and him, with echoes of the life I thought we had shared. My colleagues noticed my distraction, their concerned glances and tentative questions only deepening my sense of isolation. At home, the silence between us was suffocating. Anna tried to reach out, leaving notes on the kitchen counter, cooking dinner she knew I liked, and waiting up for me when I worked late. But every gesture felt hollow, every effort overshadowed by the knowledge of what she had done. One evening, I came home to find her sitting on the couch, staring at her phone. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes filled with a desperate vulnerability that made my stomach turn. She told me she had blocked his number, deleted every message, every photo, every reminder of their time together. She told me she wanted to prove she was committed to fixing things, to rebuilding what we had lost. I nodded, but I couldn't meet her gaze. The damage was done. The trust was gone. And no amount of erasing him from her phone could erase him from my mind. The ripple effects of her betrayal began to spread beyond our home. Friends who had once envied our marriage now looked at us with pity. Some reached out, offering their support, while others pulled away, unsure of how to navigate the fractured reality of our relationship. My parents called more often, their concern barely concealed beneath their questions about how I was doing. I gave them vague reassurances, unable to admit the full extent of my pain. Anna withdrew further into herself, her guilt and shame carving deep lines into her face. She spent hours in the guest room, journaling, reading, or simply sitting in silence. I caught glimpses of her wiping away tears when she thought I wasn't looking, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold herself together. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but the words wouldn't come. I wasn't sure if I believed them anymore. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, my phone buzzed with a notification. A friend had sent me a link to a video from the gala, the one where her betrayal had been exposed in front of everyone. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen, before finally clicking play. The shaky footage showed the room falling silent as the damning montage appeared on the screen, the gasps of the crowd audible even through the poor audio quality. Watching it felt like reliving the moment all over again. The humiliation, the anger, the overwhelming sense of loss. It all came rushing back, leaving me breathless. The comments beneath the video ranged from sympathetic to cruel, each one a reminder of how public our pain had become. When Anna saw me watching the video, she broke down. She begged me to believe her, to give her another chance, to let her prove that she could be the wife I deserved. But her words only deepened the chasm between us. I told her I needed space, that I couldn't make any promises, that I didn't know if I could ever move past what she had done. That night, I slept in the guest room again, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. The fallout of her betrayal wasn't just between us. It had seeped into every corner of my life, leaving nothing untouched. And as I lay there in the dark, I wondered if I would ever be able to piece myself back together. The days that followed felt like walking through a minefield. Every word, every glance, every shared space between Anna and me was loaded, ready to ignite the tension that had consumed our lives. I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, getting up, going to work, responding to texts from friends, but it was all a performance. Inside, I was unraveling. One evening, as I sat in the guest room, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, I came across a photo from a vacation Anna and I had taken years ago. We were on the beach, arms wrapped around each other, our smiles radiant and unforced. Looking at it now, it felt like staring at a life that belonged to someone else. The people in that photo weren't us anymore. Maybe they never were. I closed my eyes and leaned back in the chair, the memories crashing over me. I remembered the promises we had made each other, the dreams we had shared. All of it felt so distant now, like echoes from a life I couldn't quite reach. And then, beneath the weight of it all, I felt something shift. I couldn't do this anymore. That realization was like a breath of air after being underwater for too long. The pretending, the staying out of guilt or fear or inertia, it had to stop. I needed to take control, to make a decision, even if it was the hardest one I'd ever make. The next morning, I called a lawyer. The receptionist's voice was calm, professional, as she scheduled my appointment. When I hung up, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. This was it, the first step towards something final. The lawyer's office was unassuming, the kind of place you'd walk past without a second thought. Inside, the walls were lined with books, the air thick with the scent of polished wood. I sat across from a man who listened carefully as I explained my situation. I laid it all out, the betrayal, the confrontation, the months of tension and silence. When I finished, he nodded, his expression neutral but understanding. He explained my options: separation, divorce, mediation. Each word felt heavy, loaded with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But as he talked, I realized something. Staying wasn't just about trying to salvage a broken marriage. It was about clinging to the comfort of familiarity, even when that familiarity had turned toxic. When I left the office, I had a folder of paperwork in my hands and a plan in my mind. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of clarity. That evening, I came home to find Anna sitting at the dining table, her laptop open, papers spread out in front of her. She looked up when I entered, her eyes searching mine for any sign of what was coming. I sat down across from her, placing the folder between us. Her expression shifted, confusion, then dread, then resignation. I told her I had spoken to a lawyer. Her breath hitched, her hands trembling as she reached for the folder. I explained that I couldn't keep living like this, that the betrayal had broken something fundamental between us. She started to cry, her words a mix of apologies and pleas, but I held firm. This wasn't about punishing her. It was about saving myself. She asked if there was any chance of reconciliation, any way we could rebuild what we had lost. I told her I didn't know. I was too angry, too hurt, too exhausted to think about the possibility of forgiveness. All I knew was that I needed space to heal, to figure out who I was without her lies hanging over me. That night, I packed a bag. It wasn't much, just enough to get me through a few days. Anna followed me from room to room, her voice breaking as she begged me to stay. But I couldn't. The house, the memories, the weight of her presence, it was too much. I needed to breathe. As I closed the door behind me, the sound of her sobs echoed in the quiet night. My chest ached, but there was also a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, I felt like I was taking control of my life. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least it was mine to walk. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring together as I tried to process everything. Eventually, I checked into a small motel on the outskirts of town. The room was simple, the bed lumpy, but it was quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the beige walls, the silence pressing down on me. The breaking point wasn't a single moment. It was the accumulation of every lie, every broken promise, every night spent questioning the life we had built together. And as I sat there alone in that motel room, I realized something. I had broken, yes, but I hadn't shattered. There were pieces of me still intact, pieces that could be rebuilt. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The days after leaving the house were an odd mixture of grief and relief. The motel room became my sanctuary, a temporary haven where I could begin to make sense of the whirlwind my life had become. It wasn't much, a single bed, a small desk, and a window overlooking the parking lot. But it was enough. For the first time in months, I could breathe without the weight of Anna's presence pressing down on me. Each morning, I woke up to a strange silence. No sound of her moving through the house, no faint hum of her phone's notifications. Just me, the hum of the motel's heater, and the faint rustle of leaves outside. It was unnerving at first, but as the days stretched into weeks, I began to find comfort in the quiet. It felt like a blank slate, a chance to figure out who I was now that my old life had fallen apart. Work became my anchor. I threw myself into projects, arriving early and leaving late, grateful for the distraction. My colleagues noticed the change but said little, their questions held back by a mix of politeness and unease. I appreciated their restraint. I wasn't ready to talk about it. Not yet. In the evenings, I started going for walks, wandering through unfamiliar neighborhoods as the sun dipped below the horizon. The act of moving, of putting one foot in front of the other, felt grounding. It gave me time to think, to sort through the tangled mess of emotions I carried with me everywhere. One night, I found myself standing in front of a small park. Children were playing on the swings, their laughter carrying through the crisp evening air. Parents chatted on nearby benches, their voices warm and easy. I watched them for a while, feeling a pang of longing for the life I had once thought was mine. But instead of sadness, I felt something else, determination. I didn't have that life anymore, but maybe someday I could build something new. I decided to stop renting my grief and started investing in my recovery. The next day, I found a therapist. It felt strange at first, sitting across from a stranger and spilling the details of my life. But as the sessions went on, I began to uncover things I hadn't realized I was holding on to, resentment I hadn't voiced, fears I hadn't faced, hopes I thought I had lost. My therapist encouraged me to take small steps toward rediscovering myself. So I started picking up the pieces of my old hobbies, dusting off my sketch pad, strumming the guitar I hadn't touched in years, even trying my hand at cooking meals that didn't come from a takeout menu. It felt awkward at first, like I was relearning parts of myself that had gone dormant. But slowly, those small moments began to fill the void Anna had left behind. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in ages, meeting them for coffee or drinks after work. They didn't press for details, sensing that I wasn't ready to share the full story. Instead, they listened, offered light-hearted conversation, and reminded me of the joy that still existed in the world. Their presence was a balm I hadn't realized I needed. I also started taking care of my body, something I had neglected in the chaos of the past few months. The gym became my outlet, a place where I could channel my frustration, my anger, my grief. Each weight lifted, each mile run, felt like a step toward reclaiming my strength, not just physically but emotionally. Through it all, Anna's messages continued to come, her texts alternating between apologies, pleas and promises to change. I read them, but didn't respond. I wasn't ready to engage, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. The wounds she had inflicted were still too fresh, the scars not yet formed. One evening, as I sat on the edge of the motel bed, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. There were pictures of vacations, birthdays, quiet moments at home. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, a longing for the life those photos represented. But then I realized something. Those moments weren't a lie. They were real, even if they had been followed by betrayal. And while I couldn't change what had happened, I could choose how to move forward. I could carry those memories with me, not as a weight, but as a reminder of what I wanted for my future. A life built on trust, on honesty, on love. The breaking point had shattered me, but it hadn't destroyed me. And now, piece by piece, I was rebuilding. Not the life I had before, but something new, something entirely my own. Months passed, and the pieces of my life began to fit together in a way I hadn't expected. The days of numbness were fewer now, replaced by a quiet determination to move forward. It wasn't about erasing the past. There was no undoing the pain or betrayal, but about learning to live with it. Like a scar, it would always be there, but it didn't have to define me. I had moved into a small but comfortable apartment, a space that felt entirely mine. There were no shared memories here, no lingering ghosts of what once was. The walls were bare at first, but over time, they filled with framed photographs of friends, bookshelves stacked with my favorites, and a few sketches I had done in moments of quiet reflection. The apartment wasn't much, but it was a reflection of me. Imperfect, evolving, but undeniably my own. Anna's messages had grown less frequent, her once desperate pleas replaced by sporadic updates about the divorce proceedings. The paperwork was almost finalized, a fact that filled me with an odd mix of relief and sadness. I had loved her once, deeply, and letting go of that love wasn't something that happened overnight. But I had come to realize that holding on to the idea of her, the version of her I had believed in, was only holding me back. One afternoon, as I was walking through a park, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Anna. She wanted to meet, to talk one last time before the divorce was finalized. For a long moment, I stared at the screen, unsure if I wanted to face her again. But something in me knew that closure wasn't just about letting go. It was about facing what was left of the past and leaving it behind with open eyes. We met at a quiet cafe we used to visit, the air between us thick with unspoken emotions. She looked different. Her hair shorter, her face drawn, her usual confidence replaced by a quiet vulnerability. She began by apologizing again, her voice trembling as she admitted her regret and guilt. She told me she had started therapy, that she was working on herself, that she wished she could undo the choices that had led us here. I listened, letting her words wash over me without interruption. It wasn't the first time she had apologized, but this time, something about her sincerity felt different. She wasn't asking for forgiveness to ease her guilt. She was asking because she truly understood the damage she had done. When she finished, I told her I forgave her. The words came easier than I expected. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it didn't mean absolution. It meant letting go of the anger and pain that had weighed me down for so long. It meant freeing myself from the chains of the past so I could move forward. As we parted ways, I felt a strange sense of peace. The chapter of my life with Anna was closing, not with a bang, but with a quiet resolution. There was no going back, but there didn't need to be. The life we had built, the love we had shared, had run its course. And now it was time to write a new story. That evening, back in my apartment, I sat by the window with a glass of wine, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer consumed me. It was a part of me, a piece of my journey, but it didn't define who I was or where I was going. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt hope, not for reconciliation or for what could have been, but for what lay ahead. The future was uncertain, but it was mine to shape. And that, I realized, was enough. As the city hummed softly around me, I raised my glass to the quiet of the night, to the scars I carried, and to the road that stretched before me. This was my life now, imperfect, unpredictable, but beautifully mine. Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss interesting life stories, and write a comment if you like the story. See you.